The autumn night wrapped around Marcus Torres's patrol car like a cold blanket. Street lights cast long shadows across the empty streets as he drove through his usual route, his eyes scanning the familiar neighborhood. 15 years on the force had taught him to notice the smallest details, the slightest movements that seemed out of place. A flash of movement in a dark alley caught his attention. Marcus slowed the patrol car, his trained eyes fixed on the narrow space between two buildings. Something or someone had moved behind a large dumpster. In this neighborhood, at this hour, that usually meant trouble. He pulled over, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out into the crisp night air. The sound of his boots on the wet pavement echoed between the brick walls as he approached the alley. His right hand rested instinctively on his holstered weapon, while his left swept the beam of light across the ground. "Police officer," he announced, his voice firm but calm. "Is anyone there?" A subtle rustling sound came from behind the dumpster, followed by what seemed like a whimper. Marcus moved closer, his flashlight beam revealing scattered newspapers and debris. As he rounded the corner of the dumpster, the light fell upon a small figure huddled against the wall. A girl, no more than 8 years old, pressed herself further into the corner. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her dark hair tangled and matted. She looked up at Marcus with wide, terrified eyes, her small body trembling. Marcus immediately lowered his flashlight to avoid frightening her further. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl tried to scramble away, but her foot caught on a piece of cardboard, and she stumbled. Marcus reached out instinctively to catch her, but she recoiled from his touch, pressing herself against the wall. "Here," he said, slowly removing his jacket. "You must be cold." He held it out, keeping his distance. The girl stared at the offered jacket, her eyes darting between it and his face. Marcus waited patiently, remembering his training on dealing with traumatized children. After what seemed like an eternity, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar, his usual midnight snack. "Are you hungry?" he asked, unwrapping it and breaking off a piece. He placed it on the ground between them and backed away slightly, the girl's eyes fixed on the chocolate. Slowly, like a frightened animal, she reached out and snatched the piece, quickly retreating to her corner. Marcus watched as she devoured it, realizing she probably hadn't eaten in days. "My name is Marcus," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Can you tell me yours?" The girl remained silent, but her trembling had lessened slightly. Marcus tried again. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" Still no response. He pulled out his phone, knowing he needed to call social services. The girl watched his every move, tension visible in her small frame. The sound of an approaching patrol car filled the alley, and the girl's reaction was immediate and violent. She leaped to her feet, eyes wild with panic, a scream tearing from her throat. Marcus barely managed to catch her as she tried to bolt past him. "No, no, let me go," she screamed, thrashing in his arms. It's okay," Marcus repeated, holding her firmly but gently. "I won't let anyone hurt you. I promise." The girl's struggles gradually weakened, replaced by silent sobs. A tear rolled down her dirt-streaked cheek, leaving a clean trail in its wake. Marcus held her, his heart breaking at the terror this child had clearly experienced. "I want to take you somewhere safe," he said softly, still holding her. "There are people who can help you." The girl stiffened in his arms. For the first time she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "No," I promised her. Her words hung in the cold night air, making Marcus pause. The approaching patrol car's headlights swept across the alley, causing the girl to burrow deeper into his protective hold. He made a quick decision and lifted his radio. "Dispatch, this is Torres. Cancel backup. Situation under control." The patrol car rolled past, and Marcus felt the girl's rigid muscles slowly relax. She was still wearing his jacket, which hung like a blanket around her small frame. Under the dim light, He could see bruises on her wrists and ankles. "Who did you promise?" he asked softly, but she had retreated back into silence, her eyes fixed on the ground. Marcus knew protocol dictated he should call social services immediately, but something about this girl's terror and her mysterious promise made him hesitate. Years of experience told him this wasn't a typical runaway case. "Are you hungry?" he asked, changing tactics. "I know a place that makes great hot chocolate." He kept his voice casual, non-threatening. The girl glanced up briefly, a flicker of interest crossing her face before she looked away again. Marcus noticed her fingers clutching the edges of his jacket, seeking warmth. "It's just around the corner. We can walk there together, and you can warm up." He stood slowly, offering his hand but not insisting she take it. "No one will hurt you. You have my word." She studied him for a long moment, her young face showing a wisdom far beyond her years. Finally, she took a tentative step forward, though she didn't take his hand. Marcus led her to his patrol car, noting how she flinched at the sight of it. "It's okay," he assured her. "We'll just sit in here where it's warm while I make a quick call. Then we'll get that hot chocolate." The girl climbed into the passenger seat, drawing her knees up to her chest. Under the car's interior light, Marcus could see her more clearly. Her face was gaunt, her clothes at least a size too small. But what struck him most were her eyes, deep brown and filled with a sadness that no child should know. As he reached for his phone, she suddenly spoke again, her voice barely audible. "Ella." "What?" Marcus turned to her, his hand freezing mid-motion. "My name is Ella," she whispered, then fell silent again, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Marcus nodded, a small victory in gaining her trust. But as he looked at this fragile, frightened child named Ella, he knew this night was just the beginning of something much bigger, and possibly much more dangerous, than a simple case of a lost girl in an alley. "No, I promised her," she had said. The question that would haunt Marcus for days to come was simple. Who was her, and what exactly had Ella promised? Marcus stood at the hospital entrance, his discharge papers finally signed after weeks of recovery. The autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the parking lot as Ella held his hand, her small fingers intertwined with his. She wore a new blue dress, picked out by her grandmother, and her hair was neatly braided, a far cry from the frightened girl he'd found in that dark alley months ago. "Ready to go home?" he asked, squeezing her hand gently. "Which home?" Ella's voice carried a hint of uncertainty that made Marcus's heart ache. The legal proceedings had been complex but surprisingly swift, thanks to Helen's tireless work and a clear DNA match with Ella's grandparents. The Millers were loving, capable people who had spent years searching for their daughter Sarah, unaware of their granddaughter's existence until now. Moving day arrived the following weekend. Marcus watched as Ella explored her new room in her grandparents' suburban house, her few possessions barely filling a corner of the spacious bedroom. Mrs. Miller had painted the walls a soft yellow, and Mr. Miller had assembled a white desk by the window, perfect for homework and drawing. "Look what I found in the attic," Mrs. Miller said, carrying a box of Sarah's old things. Ella's eyes widened as she pulled out photo albums and teenage diaries. For the first time, she could see her mother's life before she became a mom. Sarah at school plays, at the beach, celebrating birthdays. Helen arrived that afternoon with wrapped packages, her arms full of books and art supplies. "Every detective needs the right tools," she winked at Ella, who had started drawing crime scene sketches during their investigation, much to everyone's amusement. The guardianship ceremony was small but significant. Marcus stood in his dress uniform, formally accepting the role of Ella's godfather. The judge, who had followed their case closely, smiled as she signed the papers. "Sometimes families are born from circumstances as much as blood," she remarked. Ella spent that evening decorating her new room, carefully placing photos on a cork board above her desk. There was Sarah's obituary photo, now framed and surrounded by happier memories. A candid shot of her father, laughing at something off camera, and new pictures. Ella with her grandparents at the park, Helen teaching her how to dust for fingerprints using cocoa powder in the kitchen, and Marcus in his hospital bed, giving a thumbs up. Marcus's promotion came with a new desk and increased responsibilities, but he always made time for their Sunday lunches. The Millers' dining room became a gathering place, filled with the smell of Mrs. Miller's roast chicken and the sound of Mr. Miller's terrible jokes. Ella's first day at her new school marked another milestone. Marcus dropped by that afternoon to hear all about it. She had made a friend named Lucy who shared her interest in mystery books, and her teacher was impressed by her mathematical abilities. A gift from her mother, Mrs. Miller noted proudly. On a crisp Sunday morning, they all visited the cemetery together. Ella placed fresh flowers on her parents' graves while Marcus and the Millers stood back, giving her space. She spoke softly to the headstones, telling her parents about her new life, her school, her room with the yellow walls. Later that day, during their traditional Sunday lunch, Marcus watched Ella laugh at one of her grandfather's corny jokes. Mrs. Miller was showing Helen old family photos, while Mr. Miller carved a roast. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, it almost made the dangerous events of the past few months feel like a distant dream. That evening, as the sun set, Ella stood at her bedroom window, surrounded by the life she was building. Photos of her parents smiled down from the walls, while new memories were already taking shape. A family picnic snapshot showing her sandwiched between her grandparents, Marcus's arm around them all, their faces bright with laughter. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, watching the streetlights flicker on. In the reflection, she could see her corkboard of photos, the yellow walls, the desk where she now did her homework, and the stuffed bear from her old apartment sitting proudly on her bed. For the first time since that terrible night in the alley, Ella felt completely, unconditionally safe. Through the window, she saw Marcus's car pull away after dinner, knowing he'd be back next Sunday and the Sunday after that. She touched the locket around her neck, a gift from her grandparents containing photos of both her parents, and smiled. This wasn't the ending she had expected, but perhaps it was the beginning she had always needed. From her window, Ella watched the world continue its peaceful evening routine, no longer afraid of the shadows. Inside her room, old photos of her parents shared space with a new one. Herself, her grandparents, and Marcus, her expanded family, all smiling at a Sunday picnic. She traced her finger along the frame of the newest photo, remembering that day at the park. Marcus had brought a football, insisting that every kid should learn how to throw a spiral. Her grandfather had set up the picnic blanket, while her grandmother prepared sandwiches that tasted just like the ones her mom used to make. Helen had surprised them all by showing up with homemade cookies and her camera. The memory of that day felt different from her old memories, lighter somehow, less shadowed by fear and loss. She could still hear her own laughter echoing across the park as Marcus taught her how to grip the football, her grandmother's gentle corrections to her technique, and her grandfather's enthusiastic cheering even when the ball went completely off course. Ella pulled her journal from her desk drawer, another gift from Helen, who said every good detective needs to keep detailed records. She'd been writing in it every night, documenting her new life with the same attention to detail she learned during the investigation. Tonight's entry would be about Sunday dinner, about Marcus's promise to teach her how to play chess next weekend, about the way her grandmother's eyes lit up when she asked about her mother's childhood. A soft knock at her door drew her attention. Her grandmother stood there, holding a mug of hot chocolate topped with tiny marshmallows, a new bedtime tradition they'd started. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" she asked, setting the mug on Ella's nightstand. "Yes," Ella answered, and for the first time in a long time, she meant it completely. She climbed into bed as her grandmother tucked the blankets around her, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender fabric softener, so different from the harsh detergent of her old life. Through her window, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Ella thought about all the pieces that had fallen into place. Her safe new home, her grandparents' love, Marcus's protective presence, Helen's visits, her new school, her new friend Lucy. It wasn't the family she was born into, but it was the family she needed. One built not just from tragedy, but from love, choice, and the kind of courage she didn't know she had until she needed it. She took one last look at the photos on her wall before closing her eyes, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another normal, peaceful day. In her expanding world, there was room for both the memories of what she'd lost and the joy of what she'd found. Ella drifted off to sleep, her heart finally at peace, knowing that sometimes the best families are the ones we build together. Marcus sat at his desk, Ella's whispered words still echoing in his mind. I promised her. The girl remained curled up on a worn office couch, her small frame wrapped in his oversized police jacket. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion, yet she fought sleep, watching everyone with wary eyes. Any luck with the database? Helen Martinez, his partner of 3 years, leaned over his shoulder, coffee cup in hand. Marcus shook his head, frustration evident in his tense shoulders. Nothing. No missing person reports matching her description, no recent school records, nothing in the system at all. He ran his fingers through his hair, glancing at Ella. It's like she appeared out of thin air. Helen pulled up a chair, her expression softening as she watched the girl. Let me help. 2 sets of eyes are better than one. She started typing on her own computer, the clicking of keys filling the quiet office. A loud voice suddenly cut through the peaceful atmosphere. Officer Torres. Mrs. Peterson from Social Services strode toward them, her heels clicking against the floor. I received a call about an unaccompanied minor. She needs to be processed and placed in appropriate care immediately. Ella's body tensed at the woman's approach, her knuckles white as she gripped the jacket tighter. Marcus noticed her breathing becoming rapid, the same panic from earlier threatening to return. Helen, Marcus muttered, not taking his eyes off Ella. His partner understood immediately. Mrs. Peterson. Helen intercepted the social worker, steering her toward the break room. I have some questions about another case. Would you mind? Their voices faded as Marcus returned to his search, this time expanding beyond the usual databases. Local news, recent police reports, anything that might give him a lead. His eyes caught something, a small obituary from 3 weeks ago. Sarah Miller, 35, passed away after a lengthy illness. The photo showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Something about her features. Marcus carefully approached Ella, holding the tablet with the obituary. Ella, he spoke softly. Do you know this person? The girl's eyes widened at the photo. Her lower lip trembled, and tears began rolling down her cheeks. She nodded almost imperceptibly, reaching out to touch the screen with trembling fingers. Mommy, she whispered, the word breaking into a sob. Marcus felt his heart constrict as he sat beside her, offering silent support as she cried. Helen returned, her expression grave as she took in the scene. The social workers demanding immediate action, she warned quietly. Marcus looked at Ella, remembering her terror at the sight of police cars, her mysterious promise, and now this connection to Sarah Miller. Something wasn't right, and putting her into the system now could destroy any chance of understanding what happened. I can't let her go to an institution, he decided. Not yet. Helen raised an eyebrow. Marcus, just give me time to figure this out. He gathered Ella's small form in his arms, her tears soaking his shirt. I'm taking her home. That's against every protocol we have, Helen reminded him, but she was already gathering her things. I'll cover for you here. Keep me updated. The drive to Marcus's apartment was quiet, Ella having exhausted herself into a fitful sleep in the back seat. As he carried her up to his second-floor apartment, she stirred slightly but didn't wake. He had just settled her on his couch with a blanket when his phone vibrated. Unknown number. Officer Torres, he answered quietly. A distorted voice came through the speaker. You shouldn't have found her. The voice sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He moved quickly to check his windows and door locks, drawing the curtains closed. Ella stirred on the couch but didn't wake, her small face finally peaceful in sleep. He dialed Helen immediately. "I need you to trace a call that just came into my phone. What happened? Someone knows I have her, and they're not happy about it." Marcus kept his voice low, watching Ella's steady breathing. "Run the obituary too. I want everything you can find on Sarah Miller." "Already on it. The hospital records show she was treated for a rare form of leukemia. Expensive treatments, experimental procedures. The bills must have been astronomical." Marcus processed this information, remembering Ella's reaction to police cars, her reluctance to talk. "There's more to this story, Helen. Why would a dying mother make her daughter promise to avoid the police?" "Unless she wasn't the one who made her promise," Helen suggested. The implications hung heavy in the air. Marcus looked at the sleeping girl, wondering what burden she carried on her small shoulders. He gathered some blankets and settled into an armchair near the couch, prepared for a sleepless night of watching over her. As dawn broke, Ella woke with a start, momentarily confused by her surroundings. Her eyes found Marcus, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "You're safe here," he assured her, keeping his distance to not overwhelm her. "Would you like some breakfast?" She nodded slightly, following him to the kitchen with careful steps. As Marcus prepared toast and eggs, he noticed her studying the room, her eyes lingering on the exits. The behavior seemed practiced, instinctual. "Your mom," he ventured gently, placing a plate in front of her. "She was sick for a while, wasn't she?" Ella stared at her plate, pushing the eggs around with her fork. After a long moment, she nodded. "And your dad? Was he there too?" Her hand trembled, fork clattering against the plate. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "He had to go. To protect me." Before Marcus could probe further, his phone buzzed with a text from Helen. "Found something. Hospital security footage shows suspicious men checking Sarah Miller's room repeatedly during her last days. One matches a known enforcer for the Camden drug ring." Marcus looked at Ella, pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. A dying mother, expensive medical treatments, a father's desperate choices, and a little girl caught in the middle. He'd seen too many cases where good people made bad decisions for the right reasons. His phone rang again, displaying the same unknown number as before. Ella's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes wide with recognition, as if she knew exactly what that call meant. Marcus pulled into his driveway, his mind still reeling from the anonymous call. He glanced at Ella in the rearview mirror, her small frame curled up in the back seat, clutching his old police academy sweatshirt like a lifeline. The streetlights cast long shadows across his modest suburban home as he helped her out of the car. "This is my house," he said softly, leading her up the walkway. "You'll be safe here until we figure things out." Ella's grip on his hand tightened as they approached the door. Inside, Marcus watched as Ella took in her new surroundings with cautious eyes. The living room, with its worn leather couch and family photos on the walls, seemed to put her slightly at ease. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was for this situation. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Ella nodded slightly, the first direct response he'd gotten from her in hours. In the kitchen, Marcus managed to cobble together a grilled cheese sandwich and some soup, watching as Ella devoured the food with the desperation of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. His phone buzzed again. "Helen." "Got something," she said when he answered. "Sarah Miller's medical records. The bills were astronomical, Marcus. Cancer treatments, experimental procedures. They were drowning in debt." Marcus glanced at Ella, who was now examining the refrigerator magnets with quiet curiosity. "What about the father?" "That's where it gets interesting. James Miller started making large cash deposits about 6 months before Sarah's death. Way more than his salary as a warehouse manager could explain." A crash from the kitchen interrupted their conversation. Marcus rushed in to find Ella frozen in place, a broken glass at her feet. Her eyes were wide with terror. "I'm sorry," she whispered, backing away from the mess. "Please don't make me leave." Marcus's heart clenched. He knelt beside her, carefully avoiding the glass. "Hey, it's just a glass. No one's going anywhere." He helped her onto a chair, away from the broken pieces. "Want to tell me what scared you?" Ella's lower lip trembled. "Dad said they'd hurt me if I told anyone." "Who would hurt you, Ella?" She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. Marcus didn't push further, instead focusing on cleaning up the glass while keeping her in his peripheral vision. When he finished, he found her half asleep on the chair, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. Later that night, after settling Ella in his spare room with fresh sheets and a nightlight, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with case files spread before him. Helen had dropped them off, along with some emergency supplies for Ella, clothes, toiletries, even a stuffed animal she'd picked up on the way. "You know this is completely against protocol," Helen had said, but her eyes were soft as she watched Ella sleeping through the doorway. "I know, but something bigger is going on here, Helen. Her father didn't just abandon her. He was protecting her from something, or someone." A series of photos showed James Miller's last known movements. Security camera footage from a gas station, an ATM withdrawal, a blur of a man matching his description running through a train station, all within days of Sarah's death. Marcus was studying bank statements when he heard it, a small whimper from the spare room. He found Ella thrashing in her sleep, caught in what appeared to be a nightmare. Without thinking, he sat on the edge of the bed and gently stroked her hair, the way he remembered his own father doing when he was young. "Daddy," she mumbled in her sleep. "Don't go, they're coming." Marcus stayed with her until her breathing evened out, his detective's mind racing. Whatever James Miller had gotten himself into, it had cost him his daughter. And now, somehow, Marcus had become her only protection against forces he didn't yet understand. His phone lit up with a text from Helen. Records show similar cases. All families with sick kids. All parents involved in something off the books. All disappeared. Marcus looked down at Ella's peaceful face, now calm in sleep, and made a silent promise. He would protect her, protocol be damned. He would find out what happened to her father, and he would make sure she was safe. Through the crack in the bedroom door, Marcus heard his phone ring again. When he picked it up, there was only breathing on the other end, followed by words that made his blood run cold. "You should never have found her." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at his phone in the darkness of his hallway. He immediately checked the windows and doors, drawing curtains and double-checking locks. Years of police work had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every one of them was screaming danger. He set up a makeshift bed on the couch, positioning himself between the front door and Ella's room. Sleep wouldn't come easy, but he needed to stay alert. His service weapon rested within arm's reach, something he hadn't felt the need for at home in years. Around 3 in the morning, Ella's scream pierced the silence. Marcus was on his feet instantly, weapon drawn, before realizing the threat was in her mind. She sat bolt upright in bed, eyes wide but unseeing. "They're taking him," she cried out. "Dad, come back." Marcus holstered his weapon and sat beside her, speaking in low, calming tones. "You're safe, Ella. You're at my house, remember? No one's going to hurt you here." Slowly, reality seemed to seep back into her consciousness. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and then did something unexpected. She hugged him, her small arms wrapped around his waist as she sobbed into his shirt. "They made him go away," she hiccuped between tears. "The bad men in the black car. They said Mom's medicine was too expensive. Dad had to help them, or they'd stop giving it to her." Marcus held her carefully, each word adding another piece to the puzzle. What kind of help did they want, Ella? But she was already retreating into herself, shaking her head. "Can't tell. Dad said never tell." The next morning, Helen arrived early with breakfast and news. Marcus met her in the kitchen, while Ella ate pancakes in the living room, cartoons playing quietly on TV. Found something strange, Helen said, keeping her voice low. James Miller's phone records. The day before he disappeared, he made 3 calls to a detective in narcotics. Guy named Rodriguez. Rodriguez? Marcus frowned. He retired last month. Suddenly, if I remember right. Exactly. And get this, his retirement coincided with a major drug bust going sideways. Something about pharmaceutical theft. A crash from the living room had them both running. They found Ella standing by the window, her plate shattered on the floor. Outside, a black SUV with tinted windows was parked across the street. That's their car, Ella whispered, trembling. The bad men's car. Marcus moved quickly, drawing the curtains while Helen positioned herself by the door, hand on her weapon. But when they looked again, the SUV was gone, leaving only questions and a terrified little girl who knew more than she could say. By evening, Marcus had moved Ella to a safe house Helen had arranged through unofficial channels. The small apartment belonged to Helen's sister, who was away on business. As he watched Ella finally relaxing enough to draw pictures at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed with a text. The message contained only an image, a photo of him and Ella entering his house the night before, taken from across the street. Below it, 5 words that made his jaw clench. We know where she is. Marcus parked his car in front of the worn-down apartment building, glancing at Helen, who sat in the passenger seat. Ella was quiet in the back, her small hands clutching the seatbelt. The building loomed before them, its gray facade telling stories of better days. This is it, Helen asked, checking the address one more time. Marcus nodded, watching Ella's reflection in the rearview mirror. The girl's eyes were fixed on the building, a mix of recognition and fear crossing her face. As they stepped out of the car, Ella instinctively reached for Marcus's hand. The elevator was out of order, so they climbed 4 flights of stairs. The corridor was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that spoke of neglect. Apartment 407 stood at the end of the hall, its doors showing signs of forced entry from previous police visits. Marcus used his key to unlock the door, and as it swung open, the stale air hit them. Ella's grip on his hand tightened. The apartment was a snapshot frozen in time. Dishes still in the sink, mail scattered on the coffee table, a layer of dust covering everything. My room, Ella whispered, breaking free from Marcus's hand and walking down the narrow hallway. The walls still held her drawings, cheerful stick figures in rainbow-colored houses that seemed to mock the apartment's current state. Helen started going through the papers in the living room, while Marcus followed Ella. The girl stood in the middle of her old bedroom, touching the pink bedspread that had gathered dust over the weeks. A stuffed bear sat lonely on the pillow. Look at these, Helen called from the living room. Marcus found her holding a stack of medical bills, the numbers making his eyes widen. Sarah's treatment was expensive, really expensive. As they sifted through the documents, a noise from the corridor made them freeze. Ella's reaction was immediate. She dove under her bed, a practiced movement that broke Marcus's heart. He drew his weapon, motioning for Helen to take the other side of the door. The door burst open, 2 men in dark clothes rushing in. Marcus tackled the first one, while Helen engaged with the second. Police! Drop your weapons, she shouted, but the intruder responded with a wild swing that she barely dodged. In the chaos, papers flew everywhere. Marcus managed to subdue his attacker, but the second man broke free from Helen and ran down the corridor. She gave chase, leaving Marcus to secure the first suspect. After the immediate danger passed, Marcus found Ella still under the bed, clutching her old teddy bear. "It's safe now," he said softly, helping her out. As he did, his eye caught a folder that had fallen during the fight, spilling photographs across the floor. Ella's eyes lit up at the pictures. "Daddy," she whispered, picking up one that showed a man in front of a warehouse. Marcus carefully collected the others, noting locations and dates. An elderly neighbor, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door. Mrs. Rodriguez had lived next door for 20 years, she explained, and had watched Ella grow up. "Poor Sarah," she said, shaking her head. "She fought so hard. And Tom, he was desperate to save her, always coming and going at strange hours, but you could see the love in his eyes." Marcus discovered a half-written letter in one of the drawers. Tom's hurried handwriting describing something about payments and threats. Helen returned, out of breath from the chase, but carrying a laptop she recovered from the fleeing suspect. When they checked the bank statements found in a desk drawer, the picture became clearer. Large transfers, suspicious timings, all coinciding with Sarah's treatment dates. Among the scattered papers on the floor, a handwritten note caught Marcus's eye. The paper was crumpled, the ink slightly smeared, but the words were clear. "They know about Ella. I have no choice." Helen plugged in the laptop while Ella sat on the floor, arranging the photos of her father in a neat line. Marcus noticed how her fingers lingered on each image, tracing her father's face with a gentleness that made his chest tighten. "Marcus," Helen called from the kitchen, her voice tense. "You need to see this." The laptop screen showed a series of encrypted emails, but what caught their attention was a video file dated just 3 weeks ago. In it, Tom Miller looked exhausted, his eyes darting off camera occasionally as he spoke about medical trials and experimental treatments. Ella wandered into the kitchen, still clutching her teddy bear. Her small gasp made both detectives turn. "That's where Daddy took Mommy," she said, pointing to a building visible in the video's background. Marcus recognized the location, an abandoned medical facility on the outskirts of town, one that had been shut down for code violations years ago. The pieces were starting to fit together. Sarah's expensive treatment, Tom's desperate actions, the suspicious transfers. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared again at the door, this time with a small box. "I found this in my apartment last week," she said, handing it to Marcus. "Tom asked me to keep it safe, but he never came back for it." Inside the box, they found more medical documents, but these were different. They detailed experimental procedures, and signed consent forms, and a list of names other patients who had undergone similar treatments. "Look at these dates," Helen said, comparing the documents to the bank statements. "Each transfer correlates with a treatment session." A sudden crash from the hallway made everyone jump. Marcus drew his weapon again, but this time it was just the building's ancient pipes groaning. Still, the fear in Ella's eyes told him they'd stayed too long. As they prepared to leave, Ella insisted on taking her bear and a small photo album she'd found under her bed. Marcus did a final sweep of the apartment, his trained eye catching details he'd missed before. The scratch marks on the door frame, the hastily packed closets, the signs of a family that left in a hurry but expected to return. Helen gathered the most important documents while Marcus helped Ella pack a few precious belongings into a small backpack. As they headed toward the door, the girl stopped and ran back to her room one last time. She returned with a folded piece of paper, a child's drawing of 3 stick figures. A man, a woman, and a little girl, all holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Among the documents they collected, a single piece of paper fluttered to the floor as they left. Marcus picked it up, reading the hastily scrawled note that would change everything. "They know about Ella. I have no choice." Marcus slumped in his chair as Captain Rodriguez's voice echoed through the office. "This is completely unprofessional, Torres. You can't keep a witness in your house, especially a minor. Sir, with all due respect, Ella has nowhere else to go right now," Marcus argued, his fingers drumming nervously on his thigh. "The system failed her once. I won't let it happen again." Helen stood by the door, her arms crossed. "Captain, Marcus is right. This case is more complex than it seems. We've uncovered evidence of organized crime involvement." The captain's face reddened. "That's exactly why you should follow protocols. This isn't some TV show where cops can play hero." Back at his desk, Marcus dove into the suspicious bank transfers they'd discovered. Large sums moved through various accounts, all leading to an underground medical clinic. Helen brought him a coffee and sat on the edge of his desk. "Look at this," she pointed to her tablet. Sarah Miller's treatment costs were astronomical. The experimental drugs alone. A scream interrupted them. Ella was thrashing on the office couch, caught in another nightmare. Marcus rushed to her side, gently shaking her awake. "Hey, kiddo, it's okay. You're safe." Ella's eyes darted around the room, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, they were hurting Dad." Marcus exchanged a look with Helen. They'd found evidence that Thomas Miller had gotten involved with a criminal organization to pay for his wife's treatment. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was getting darker by the minute. Later that afternoon, their informant Jimmy met them in a dingy coffee shop. "The organization you're looking into, they're bad news. They import experimental drugs, sell them to desperate people for 10 times the price." Ella, who had insisted on coming along and was coloring at a nearby table, suddenly froze. Her crayon clattered to the floor as she stared at a man in a photo on Jimmy's phone. "That's the bad man," she whispered. "The one who came to our house." Helen immediately took a screenshot, running facial recognition. Within minutes, they had a name. Victor Ramirez, known associate of the Cortez drug cartel. Back at the precinct, Marcus was protecting Ella from persistent reporters when his phone rang. The voice was distorted, threatening. "Back off, detective. The girl knows things she shouldn't." Ella spent the afternoon drawing, her small hands moving purposefully across the paper. Marcus watched as a strange symbol took shape, a serpent wrapped around a medical cross. Helen's research confirmed it. The logo of a shadow pharmaceutical company linked to multiple deaths. The pressure from social services intensified. A stern-faced woman in a gray suit delivered an ultimatum. Either surrender Ella to the system or face disciplinary action. As Marcus sat at his desk, wrestling with his options, Helen burst in. "I found something!" Thomas Miller's credit card was just used at a motel outside the city. Hope flickered in Marcus's chest, but before he could respond, his phone rang again. This time, the voice made his blood freeze. "Marcus, it's me, her father." Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. "Thomas, where are you?" "Listen carefully." Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "They're watching me. I never abandoned her. You have to understand, Sarah's treatment, the debts, they gave me no choice." Ella looked up from her drawing, sensing the tension. Helen moved closer, recording the call while trying to trace it. "The organization," Thomas continued. "They're using desperate families. The experimental drugs, the fake hope, it's all a scheme. I gathered evidence, but they found out. Sarah wasn't supposed to." His voice cracked. A crash echoed through the phone, followed by shuffling sounds. "Thomas," Marcus called out, but the line went dead. Helen grabbed her jacket. "I got a partial trace. Industrial district, near the old pharmaceutical warehouse." Marcus knelt beside Ella. "Sweetie, I need you to stay with Officer Chin for a while. Can you do that for me?" Ella clutched her drawing, tears welling up. "Don't leave me. Please. I promise I'll come back. We're going to find your dad." As Marcus and Helen sped toward the industrial district, dispatch reported suspicious activity near their destination. 3 black SUVs had been spotted in the area. "The symbol Ella drew," Helen said, pulling up images on her tablet. "It matches the logo found on counterfeit medication seized last month. The cartel's been using legitimate pharmaceutical companies as fronts." They arrived to find the warehouse dark and seemingly empty. As they approached, a security camera tracked their movement. Inside, papers were scattered everywhere, signs of a hasty departure. Marcus's phone buzzed, a photo message. Thomas Miller, beaten and tied to a chair, holding today's newspaper. Below the image, text appeared, "Back off or he dies." Helen discovered a laptop, still warm. Marcus, look at this. Financial records, shipping manifests. Thomas was collecting evidence against them. He wasn't running from Ella, Marcus realized. He was protecting her by keeping his distance. A door slammed somewhere in the building. Footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. Marcus and Helen drew their weapons, moving toward the sound. Police, show yourself. The footsteps quickened, then stopped. A voice called out from the darkness. Detective Torres, I've watched you with Ella, taking her in, playing hero. Did you really think we wouldn't notice? Multiple red dots from laser sights appeared on Marcus's chest. Helen ducked behind a column as shots rang out. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Officer Chen's panicked voice. Detective, someone just tried to breach the precinct. Ella's safe, but... Before he could respond, Marcus's phone rang again. He knew who it was before answering. This time, though, the voice was different, desperate, determined. Marcus, it's me, her father. Marcus stared at his phone, his heart pounding as he heard the voice he'd been searching for. Marcus, it's me, her father. The call lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to set everything in motion. As he hung up, he turned to find Ella standing in the doorway of his living room, her small figure illuminated by the early morning light. Was that my daddy? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus nodded, already reaching for his keys. We're going to see him, sweetie, but we need to be very careful, okay? He called Helen immediately, and within an hour, they had orchestrated a careful plan. The meeting would take place in an abandoned warehouse district. Not ideal, but secure enough for a quick exchange. Helen had positioned plainclothes officers strategically around the perimeter, while Marcus would approach with Ella. As they drove through the city, Marcus noticed a black SUV that had been following them for the past 10 minutes. Hold on tight, sweetheart, he said, making a sudden turn down a narrow alley. Ella gripped her seatbelt, her knuckles white as Marcus executed a series of evasive maneuvers he'd learned in tactical driving. The SUV stayed on their tail, getting closer with each turn. Marcus's police radio crackled to life with Helen's voice. Marcus, you've got another vehicle coming in from the east. They're trying to box you in. Ella's breath quickened, but she remained surprisingly calm. I know where we are, she said suddenly. Mommy used to take me to a park near here. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Which park, Ella? The one with the big blue slide. Daddy would meet us there sometimes when he was working late. A plan formed in Marcus's mind. He knew the park. It had multiple exits and a layout he could use to their advantage. Swinging the car around, he headed there instead of the warehouse. Just as they pulled into the park's parking lot, a figure appeared in the distance, Ella's father. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the space. Ella pressed her face against the window, tears streaming down her cheeks. Daddy! The crack of gunfire shattered the moment. Marcus threw himself over Ella as bullets peppered the car. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of her father returning fire, trying to give them cover. Stay down, Marcus ordered, pulling his weapon while keeping Ella protected behind the car's engine block. Helen's voice came through again, reporting that backup was en route. The firefight intensified, with shots coming from multiple directions. Between the bursts of gunfire, Ella's voice cut through. Daddy taught me a code, she said, her words muffled against Marcus's jacket. For when things were bad, he said if I ever heard him say red butterfly, I should remember the numbers. Marcus's mind raced. During the brief phone call, her father had mentioned something about a red butterfly. What numbers, Ella? What did he tell you to remember? 7319, she recited. He said it was important. The sound of sirens filled the air as backup arrived. The shooters began to retreat, but not before one final burst of gunfire. Marcus saw Ella's father stumble, red blooming across his shirt. He disappeared behind a row of cars, just as SWAT teams swarmed the area. In the aftermath, They found blood on the sidewalk, but no sign of Ella's father. Helen discovered his true identity. He'd been working undercover, trying to expose a pharmaceutical trafficking ring. The same organization that had controlled the experimental treatments that might have saved Sarah's life. Back at the station, as Ella slept fitfully on the break room couch, Marcus decoded the message her father had left. Hidden within police records, case number 7319 contained a single coded note. Look for the red box under the church pew. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Marcus coordinated with Helen to analyze every church in the area, while keeping Ella safe at his apartment under protective surveillance. The girl hadn't spoken much since the shooting, but her eyes followed Marcus's every move, as if afraid he too would disappear. Late that night, while reviewing security footage from the park incident, Marcus noticed something peculiar. In the moments before the shooting, Ella's father had been making deliberate hand gestures, not random movements, but a pattern. He called Helen immediately. "It's ASL," Helen confirmed after reviewing the footage. He was signing something about St. Michael's. The old St. Michael's Church had been abandoned for years, sitting on the outskirts of town like a forgotten sentinel. It made perfect sense. An ideal dead drop location, away from prying eyes. Before they could act on this information, Marcus's phone buzzed with an alert from the hospital. John Doe, gunshot victim, matching the description of Ella's father. Marcus's heart sank as he read the preliminary report. He knew he had to tell her, but the words stuck in his throat. Ella seemed to sense it before he spoke. "He's not coming back, is he?" she asked, her small voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. Marcus pulled her close, letting her cry into his shirt. "Your daddy was very brave, Ella. He did everything he could to protect you." Through her sobs, Ella shared fragments of memories, secret codes, hidden messages, and late-night moves from one place to another. Each detail painted a clearer picture of a father desperate to keep his daughter safe, while fighting against a powerful criminal organization. Helen arrived with the official confirmation. Ella's father had succumbed to his injuries, but not before leaving one final message with a nurse. The message was simple. "Tell Marcus, remember the red butterfly." As dawn broke, Marcus held the sleeping Ella, her father's final message echoing in his mind. The code she'd remembered, the church, the red box. It all led to something bigger, something worth dying to protect. The message in the police records became their last hope. Look for the red box under the church pew. The old church stood against the darkening sky, its weathered stones holding secrets Marcus hoped would finally bring answers. Ella's small hand gripped as tightly as they approached the heavy wooden doors, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. "This is it," Ella whispered, her eyes scanning the building's facade. Marcus nodded, pushing the door open slowly. The musty scent of aged wood and forgotten prayers filled their nostrils as they stepped inside. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the dusty floor. They moved carefully between the rows of empty pews, Ella's eyes fixed on a particular bench her father had mentioned. "There," she pointed, recognizing a small cross carved into the wood's edge. Marcus knelt, running his fingers along the underside of the bench until he felt it, a metal box secured with duct tape. With careful movements, he detached it and pulled out a worn red box, about the size of a shoebox. Ella's breath caught as he placed it on the bench between them. Inside, they found a stack of documents, photographs, and a small envelope with Ella's name written in her father's distinctive handwriting. The photos showed her father in various locations, some with people Marcus recognized from police files. But it was the documents that made his blood run cold. Detailed records of drug shipments, medical supply routes, and names of corrupt officials. "Your father," Marcus said softly. "He was working with the FBI." Before Ella could respond, Helen's voice crackled through Marcus's phone. "Marcus, we've got confirmation. He was deep undercover, investigating a prescription drug trafficking ring. The same people who were controlling the experimental treatments for Sarah." Ella pulled out an old family photo from the box, her fingers tracing her mother's smile. "Dad always said Mom's medicine was special," she murmured. "He said he had to work extra hard to get it." The sound of car doors slamming outside made them both freeze. Through the colored glass, Marcus could see several dark SUVs parking around the church. Men in suits emerged, their movements too coordinated to be coincidental. "FBI!" A voice called from outside. "Come out with your hands visible." Marcus's instinct screamed that something wasn't right. He'd worked enough cases to know when an operation felt off. That's when he noticed Ella quietly sliding something into her pocket, a small flash drive that had been taped to the bottom of the box lid. They had seconds to move. Marcus guided Ella toward the vestry just as the church doors burst open. The sound of multiple footsteps filled the sacred space as agents spread through the building. In the narrow corridor behind the altar, Marcus and Ella ran, their footsteps muffled by the ancient carpet. A shot rang out, splintering the wood beside them. These weren't FBI agents. At least, not all of them were. "Helen!" Marcus spoke urgently into his phone as they ducked into a side room. "We've got corrupt agents. I need backup at St. Michael's now." Ella's eyes were wide but steady. She tugged Marcus's sleeve and pointed to a hidden door behind a tapestry, the kind of escape route common in old churches. As they slipped through, Marcus heard Helen's voice again. "Marcus, we've ID'd a mole in the department. Detective Rivers has been feeding information to the traffickers." They emerged into a small courtyard just as more shots rang out. Marcus shielded Ella with his body as they ran toward the iron gate. The flash drive in Ella's pocket suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Whatever was on it had cost her father's life. Hours later, safe in a secure location Helen had arranged, Marcus connected the flash drive to a laptop. Ella sat beside him, her father's last message loading on the screen. The man they both knew appeared, looking tired but determined. "If you're watching this," the video began, "then I'm already dead." The message continued, John Miller's face showing the weight of his secrets. "What I've uncovered goes deeper than anyone imagined. The drug ring isn't just about profit. They're testing experimental treatments on desperate patients like Sarah." His voice cracked at the mention of his wife. Ella pressed closer to Marcus, her small shoulders shaking. On screen, her father continued, "I kept records of everything. Names, dates, locations. The real FBI investigation was compromised months ago. Agent Reynolds is working for them. He's been coordinating the whole operation from inside." Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Helen. "FBI director confirmed. Reynolds went dark 3 weeks ago. Real agents en route." The video showed John shuffling through papers. "Ella, baby, if you're watching this, I'm so sorry. Everything I did was to save your mom, but when I discovered what they were really doing..." He wiped his eyes. "Marcus, I know you'll find this. Protect her. The evidence on this drive will bring down their entire network, but they'll kill to keep it quiet." Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside their safe room. Marcus quickly pulled Ella behind a filing cabinet, drawing his weapon. The door creaked open, but it was Helen, her gun already drawn. "We need to move," she said urgently. "They found Detective Rivers in his apartment. He's dead, but his phone shows our location was compromised." As if to confirm her words, glass shattered somewhere in the building. Ella, showing remarkable composure, reached into her pocket and pulled out a second flash drive. "Dad said to trust only the heart," she whispered, pointing to a tiny heart sticker on one drive. "The other one is fake." Marcus stared at the girl, amazed at her father's foresight and her own strength. The sound of approaching vehicles spurred them into action. Helen led them through a back exit, while Marcus transmitted the drive's contents to secure servers he trusted. In the growing darkness, as they rushed toward Helen's unmarked car, the full weight of John Miller's sacrifice became clear. He hadn't abandoned his daughter. He'd given everything to protect her and expose a corruption that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. Ella clutched her father's last message close as they drove through the city's shadows. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes holding both grief and determination. "Dad said you'd keep me safe," she whispered. "He said you were different from the others." Behind them, sirens wailed in the night. But Marcus couldn't tell anymore which ones were friend and which were foe. The only certainty was the truth contained in that small flash drive and the trust in Ella's eyes. The flash drive blinked its small red light, containing a father's last gift to his daughter. The truth that would both endanger and ultimately save her. On the laptop screen, the final frame of John Miller's message still glowed. "If you're seeing this, then I'm already dead." Marcus sat in his dimly lit living room, his hands trembling as he inserted the flash drive into his laptop. Ella curled up next to him on the couch, her small fingers gripping his arm. The video started playing, and James Miller's tired face filled the screen. Ella's breath caught in her throat. "If you're watching this," James began, his voice rough with emotion, "then I didn't make it. Marcus, I know you're protecting my daughter. Thank you." Tears streamed down Ella's face as she watched her father's final message. The sound of Helen's urgent footsteps coming up the stairs interrupted the moment. "Marcus, we've got company. They've found us." She was already drawing her weapon. Marcus quickly pocketed the flash drive and lifted Ella into his arms. "Back door now!" They barely made it to his car when the first bullet shattered his living room windows. The chase through the city streets was relentless. Marcus weaved through traffic, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back occasionally to make sure Ella stayed down. She hadn't made a sound, her training for months on the run with her father showing through. The warehouse district, Helen's voice crackled through the radio. "I've got backup coming." Marcus took a sharp turn into a narrow alley between two abandoned warehouses. The screech of tires behind them confirmed they weren't alone. Ella suddenly sat up. "Marcus, I know this place. Dad and we hid here once." Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed social services. "Detective Torres, we're coming to take the girl. This has gone too far." "Not now," he growled, ending the call as another burst of gunfire hit the car's rear window. Ella ducked instinctively, but not before pointing to a rusty door. "There, that's where we stayed." Marcus pulled into the loading dock, killing the engine. "Helen, we're in Warehouse 7. They're right behind us." He grabbed Ella's hand, and they ran inside. The warehouse was a maze of old shipping containers and forgotten machinery. Ella moved with surprising confidence, leading Marcus through the shadows. "Dad showed me all the hiding places," she whispered. They could hear multiple footsteps echoing through the vast space. Helen's voice came through Marcus's radio again, barely a whisper. "I've got eyes on 4 hostiles. Where are you?" Before Marcus could answer, a voice boomed through the warehouse. "Give us the drive, Torres. The girl knows too much anyway. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ella tugged at Marcus's sleeve, using the special code her father had taught her. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. Marcus understood. There was another exit. They moved silently between containers, but a sudden noise made them freeze. Detective Torres, a new voice, the social worker. "This is completely unacceptable. Come out immediately. They're using the social workers to flush us out." Helen's whispered warning came through. Marcus made a split-second decision. He needed to protect both the evidence and Ella. He knelt beside her. "Remember what your dad taught you about the secret compartment?" Ella nodded, her eyes wide but determined. "Take the drive. Hide it where only you know. I'll draw them away." He hugged her quickly, feeling her small hands squeeze him tight before she disappeared into the shadows. Marcus moved in the opposite direction, making enough noise to attract attention. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. He returned fire, diving behind a forklift as bullets pinged off metal all around him. Helen's voice shouted from somewhere above, "Police! Drop your weapons!" More shots, more shouting. Marcus caught glimpses of Ella's small form moving through the shadows, heading toward the hidden exit. She was almost there when he saw one of the gunmen turn toward her position. Marcus broke cover, firing rapidly. The gunman went down, but another had a clear shot at Marcus. Time seemed to slow as he realized he couldn't dodge in time. A shot rang out through the warehouse, echoing off the metal walls, followed by Ella's desperate scream. Marcus! The bullet caught Marcus in the shoulder, spinning him around. Through the haze of pain, he saw Ella starting to run toward him. "No!" he shouted. "Get to safety!" Helen's precise shots from above forced the remaining gunman to take cover. The social worker's voice was still calling out, closer now, mixed with the sounds of approaching sirens. Marcus pressed his hand against his wound, warm blood seeping between his fingers. "Target the girl!" one of the gunmen shouted. "She has the drive." Marcus forced himself up, using the forklift as cover. He couldn't let them get to Ella. Through blurry vision, he saw her reach the hidden panel her father had shown her. Her small fingers worked quickly, opening it just as her father had taught her. 2 more shots rang out. Helen had taken down another gunman. "Marcus, status," she called out. "I'm hit but mobile," he managed through gritted teeth. "Cover the north exit." The remaining gunmen were getting desperate. One of them grabbed the social worker, using her as a shield. "Come out, little girl, or this nice lady gets hurt." Ella had frozen at the hidden panel, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus caught her gaze and gave her their secret signal. 3 blinks, a nod. She understood, quickly sliding the drive into the compartment and sealing it. "Last chance, Torres," the gunman shouted. "The drive or the social worker." Marcus saw Ella's hands moving in their secret code again. 4 taps. Pause. 1 tap. There was another way out to the panel. He needed to buy her time. "Okay," Marcus called out, slowly standing with his hands up. "Let's talk about this." The gunman's attention shifted to Marcus, giving Helen the opening she needed. Her shot was perfect, catching him in the leg. The social worker broke free, running toward the exit as police sirens grew louder outside. Ella had disappeared into the wall panel. Only Marcus knew she was safe, making her way through the hidden passage her father had prepared. The remaining gunmen, wounded and cornered, fired wildly in frustration. Marcus slumped against the forklift, his shoulder burning. But he was smiling. Ella had made it. The drive was secure. Helen was already calling for medical backup as she secured the scene. Through the pain and chaos, Marcus heard tiny footsteps in the walls, growing fainter. Ella was following her father's escape route, just as they had planned. The evidence was safe, and more importantly, so was she. The warehouse erupted with police activity as backup finally arrived. As paramedics rushed to Marcus, he saw the hidden panel from the corner of his eye. A small hand appeared briefly, giving him their secret sign for "I'm okay," before disappearing again. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the warehouse, followed by Ella's desperate scream. "Marcus!" The hospital corridor lights flickered as medical staff rushed Marcus through the emergency doors, their voices urgent and focused. Ella ran alongside the gurney until a nurse gently held her back, her small hands reaching out desperately toward the only person she trusted. Helen grabbed the girl's shoulders, pulling her close as they watched the medical team disappear behind the swinging doors. "He'll be okay, sweetie," Helen whispered, but her voice trembled slightly. She had seen the amount of blood seeping through Marcus's shirt at the warehouse. The bullet had missed his heart by inches. Ella refused to sit in the waiting room chairs, instead standing guard by the emergency room doors. Her eyes, red from crying, remained fixed on the entrance where they had taken Marcus. Helen coordinated with the officers stationed around the hospital perimeter through her radio, ensuring no one could get near them. "Detective." Officer Rodriguez approached Helen, holding a manila envelope. The DNA results from the database search just came in. You need to see this. Helen opened the envelope while keeping one eye on Ella. Her breath caught as she scanned the report. There was a match, a familial DNA connection to Sarah Miller's parents. They were alive and living just 3 hours away in Hartford. Time became their enemy. Helen knew the criminals would make one final attempt to silence them, and Marcus's shooting proved they were getting desperate. She gathered her team, dispatching units to secure the route to Hartford, while others maintained hospital security. Ella's voice, barely a whisper, broke through Helen's tactical planning. I remember something. The girl's fingers twisted the hem of her shirt. Mom used to show me pictures of a white house with blue shutters. She said that's where she grew up. Helen pulled up property records on her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. There it was, 1247 Maple Street, Hartford. A white colonial with blue shutters, owned by Robert and Margaret Wilson for the past 30 years. The drive to Hartford was tense. Ella sat in the back of Helen's unmarked car, protected by 2 patrol cars ahead and behind. She had refused to leave without her backpack, which contained the small stuffed bear Marcus had retrieved from her old apartment. As they approached the Wilson residence, Ella pressed her face against the window. The White House emerged from behind mature oak trees, its blue shutters exactly as Sarah had described them. An elderly couple stood on the porch, alerted by the police presence. Margaret Wilson's hands flew to her mouth when she saw Ella step out of the car. Even after 8 years, there was no mistaking her granddaughter's face. She had Sarah's eyes. The reunion was interrupted by screeching tires. 2 black SUVs rounded the corner, and gunfire erupted. Helen threw herself over Ella, dragging her behind a patrol car. The police returned fire as the Wilsons were rushed inside their home. Back door, Helen commanded, leading Ella through the house and into the backyard. They crouched behind a garden shed as officers engaged the attackers. The firefight was brief but intense, ending with 3 arrests and 1 suspect dead. Back at the hospital that evening, Marcus had stabilized. His eyes fluttered open to find Ella curled up in a chair beside his bed, clutching her bear. Helen stood by the window, watching the sunset while keeping guard. The DNA results confirmed it. Helen reported softly to Marcus. They're her maternal grandparents. All the paperwork checks out. They've been searching for Sarah and Ella since Sarah cut contact 8 years ago. The Wilsons sat in the hospital cafeteria, sharing photos with social services and providing documentation of their relationship. Their grief over Sarah's death mixed with joy at finding their granddaughter. Ella had started to smile again, especially when Margaret showed her baby pictures of her mother. As the day wound down, Helen completed the final arrest reports. The criminal organization was dismantled, their leadership in custody. The evidence from the warehouse had been decisive, and Marcus's shooting had only strengthened the case against them. Marcus watched Ella interact with her grandparents through the hospital room window. Her small hand was clasped in Margaret's as Robert showed her an old family photo album. For the first time since he'd found her in that alley, she looked like she belonged somewhere. "I don't want to go," Ella whispered, holding Marcus's hand in the hospital bed. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she gripped his hand tighter. Marcus, still weak from surgery, managed to squeeze back gently. "Your grandparents seem really nice," he said softly, trying to mask his own emotion. "And they loved your mom very much." Helen watched from the doorway as Margaret Wilson approached with a fresh cup of coffee for Ella. Hot chocolate, actually. The grandmother hesitated, sensing the delicate moment between the detective and her granddaughter. "Did you know," Margaret said, stepping into the room, "that your mother used to love hot chocolate too? Especially with tiny marshmallows." She set the cup on the bedside table and pulled out a small bag of mini marshmallows from her pocket. Ella's eyes widened slightly, though she didn't let go of Marcus's hand. Robert joined them, carrying the photo album they'd been looking through earlier. "We have a whole room ready for you," Robert said gently. "It was your mother's old room, but we can change anything you don't like." "Can Marcus visit?" Ella asked, her voice small but determined. The Wilsons exchanged a look before Margaret stepped forward. Of course he can, sweetheart. He'll always be welcome in our home. Helen cleared her throat, drawing attention to the papers in her hand. I finished processing all the protective custody documentation. The Wilsons have temporary custody while the final arrangements are made. She paused, looking at Marcus. And there's something else we need to discuss about Marcus's continued involvement. Ella's grip on Marcus's hand tightened again, fear flashing across her face. The heart rate monitor beside his bed beeped slightly faster. Don't worry, Helen said quickly, moving closer. It's actually good news. Given the circumstances of the case and Marcus's role in protecting Ella, the department is supporting his petition to remain legally connected to her welfare. What does that mean? Ella asked, looking between the adults. Marcus smiled weakly. It means if everyone agrees, I could be your official guardian too, like a godfather. I'd always be part of your life, legally and officially. The tension in Ella's shoulders eased slightly as Margaret placed a gentle hand on her back. That sounds wonderful, the grandmother said. Doesn't it, Ella? You'd have all of us looking out for you. Robert Wilson nodded in agreement, setting the photo album down. Family comes in many forms, he said wisely. And after everything that's happened, I think we could all use more family, not less. Through the hospital window, the city lights began to twinkle as evening settled in. The soft beeping of medical equipment created a quiet rhythm in the room as Ella finally reached for the hot chocolate, her other hand still firmly holding on to Marcus's. I don't want to go, Ella whispered again, holding Marcus's hand in the hospital bed.